Great. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This is a session to talk about a specific feature for the MetroAE toolset. We recently released the MetroAE version 4.1. It has a number of features, and I encourage you to go to the GitHub site to read about those features. But in particular today, we want to focus in on a new feature that's kind of a departure for us. It's called MetroAE Config. Up until now, MetroAE has been very focused on what I call deployment. So it's doing installation, it's doing upgrade or migration. Well, with the MetroAE Config tool, we're stepping into the area of configuration of the VSD. So all of the things that you can do, or many of the things that you can do via the GUI or via the VSD API can now be supported by the MetroAE tool. And we're going to hear about that. Now on the line today, we have the whole MetroAE team. In particular, we have Mike, who's going to go through some slides and explain the MetroAE config tool. We also will have Iswar on the line, who will be doing a demo for us. So you can see the tool in action. I also see that we have Simon Fidian on the line with us. Simon is, and Ben Niven-Jenkins, and Simon and Ben were instrumental in the development of this feature. And as we talk about the templates and the features that are currently supported, those two are behind those and behind the ability of us to support those features. So if you have questions about features and things, Ben and Simon are on the line as well to help us out. So with that, Mike, I'd like to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Brian. My name is Mike Pykosh, and I'm in Brian's team working on Metro and other tools. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about our new tool released in the MetroAE 4.1 release, which we just released recently, and it's called MetroAE Config. And so our agenda today is I'm going to talk to you about what is MetroAE Config. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to demonstrate the way it operates, and I'll talk about why it's superior to just using Python coding, and then I'll hand it off to Ishwar later for a live demo of the tool. All right, so what is MetroAE Config? Very simply, it applies configurations to VSDs. As I mentioned, it is included in the 4.1 release of MetroAE, which just went out, but it's only supported in the container. It is not supported with the repo version of MetroAE at this time. The key feature, the key property of MetroAE config is that it's 100% data-driven architecture. And what that means is that it can do all of the configuration with zero coding necessary. The idea is that the user, you, would supply configuration data, and that we, the Metro team, would supply templates that would apply that data to the VSD to various features and configuration objects. With the tool, today, currently, we are supplying more than 75 templates for some of the most popular and widely used features and objects on the VSD. And in the future, there will be more. The tool is easily extendable to new VSD features. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. And we have the ability to create custom templates to handle very specific use cases as needed. All right, so a little bit, so how does MetroAE config work? Well, configurations are applied via templates. And for those of you that have used Python or are familiar with Ansible, these are Jinja templates, although that's not important to understand. The templates that MetroAE config uses defines a set of variables that are required to be received from the user, and those variables are used to configure the VSD objects or features. So the user provides those data sets, and then the values in those data sets are validated against a schema to make sure that they are consistent and they match the data types required by the configuration. And then once it's ensured that the inputs are valid, each data set is applied to the template, is rendered and substituted into the template, and then applied to the VSD by the tool. A revert action is provided so that any configuration that's applied can also be removed. So say there's an error or there's a mistake, something needs to be changed, or if simply you just want the configuration removed, the revert action undoes the creation of the config. On the slide, you have the some of the actions that are supported by MetroAE Config. So all commands start with the MetroAE Config prefix, and then the specific action for the config follows that. Create is the main action, and what that does is it takes the user data that we've been talking about, supplied by the user, and it applies that data to the VSD. The update command is very similar to create, except that if the configuration is already present on the VSD, it will no longer error on conflict. It will instead just overwrite any configuration that's already present. I mentioned about the revert. Revert removes any configuration from the VSD, and I want to mention that it's the exact opposite of create. So anything that was created with the user data from the create command would be reverted from using the revert command. There is a validate command, and what the validate command is like a dry run, where the config tool simulates the rendering of all the templates and the application to the VSD without actually writing to the VSD. And it does this to make sure that all of the input data is valid as far as the tool can determine, and that there's no errors and everything's consistent. The remaining commands are informational commands. So the templates action will list all of the templates that are loaded into the tool. And as I mentioned, we're shipping with 75 plus of those. And then the following commands can give you more detailed information per template. So for instance, the document command will provide you with markdown MD files, providing documentation for each template. An example, the example command will provide user data example, so it's more easily filled in by a user, and then you don't have to actually derive that by looking at the template. And then for more advanced users, you can actually dump a JSON schema, and JSON schema is a validation. It's a standardized validation format. So if you have an external tool that manages data, the user data can be validated against the schema that's provided. All right, so I'm going to jump into the templates that MetroAE Config uses. As I mentioned, these are Jinja templates for those who are aware of Jinja, but it's not important. So this is one of the templates that is supplied in with the tool. However, I've simplified it to fit on a slide. The concepts that I'm going to talk about still apply. I just trimmed out some of the meat of it to be more concise. I want to mention also that we're not forcing people to write templates. We as the Metro team have written 75 of these, and I fully intend to support more in the future. So let's talk about the parts of these templates. At the beginning, at the start, it has the name of the template, this is the enterprise template. And then following that, there's a variables section. And these define the user data input that is required from the user to apply this template to the VSD. In this case, this is again simplified, but we're requiring 3 pieces of information. So you have in green, you have the enterprise name, the description, and the local AS. And there's some information in the variable section, such as the type. So the local AS is an integer, for instance. And then descriptions, and if they're required or optional. Following the variable section, you have the actions, and this is where the real functionality lives. So for each data set that's provided by the user, the actions will be rendered with those variable sets and then applied to the VSD. So if you can see under the actions, there's a create object, and it's creating an enterprise object. And then it's setting the values of the fields of that object. And you can see name, description, AS. And then you'll see what are called Ginger tags. And these are double curly braces. So you can see enterprise name, description, and local AS are in curly braces. This is where the variables from the user are substituted in to the template to be applied to the VSD. This templating format also allows for some mild transformations in the form of what are called filters. So you can see in the description, there's actually a default. And what that does is if you don't provide a description, one will be defaulted for you based on the enterprise name. Again, the details are not important as we as the Metro team are supplying the configuration templates for you. We just need your user information. Okay, so here we're going to apply this template to the VSD, and this is literally how you would do it. There are a set of installation and parameter specifying parts that will be talked about by Ishwar a little later. But the command is MetroAE Config Create, and then you provide a user data file. And in this case, there's the enterprises.yaml configuration file, user data file. And this defines those user data values that are required by the user to be applied to the VSD. So in this case, you'll see under enterprises, we're specifying enterprise, the template name as enterprise, and then the values to be applied using that template. So each one of these value sets is going to be applied to the VSD. And I have 4 fictional Star Wars planets that are being applied to the VSD. Tatooine, Hoth, Dagobah, and Endor, and you can see that they have their differing descriptions and local ASs. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing a screenshot from the VSD after this configuration has been applied to the VSD. Shared infrastructure, as most of you know, is a defaulted enterprise that's always there on the VSD. But you can see the 4 other enterprises that were created by the MetroAE config tool. So I'm going to show a slightly more complex configuration. This is one where we're using nesting. And I want to mention that nesting is not required. You can do everything in a very flat manner. You could just say template and then describe the template and then provide all the values. However, nesting, what nesting allows is it allows the children templates to inherit the information from the parent. So in this case, I'm only creating one enterprise, Tatooine, but its children live off of the enterprise. So there's 2 L3 domains, Skywalker and Solo, and they are inheriting the enterprise from the enterprise name from the enterprise template above. So you can see there's a kind of a tree of configuration objects that's being created due to this these templates being nested. And then finally, there's a zone, and the zone lives under an enterprise and a domain. Thus, you can see that it's a child of the domain and a grandchild of the enterprise. So there's a number of important features that MetroAE Config provides for us. One is object dependency reordering, and it's a fancy way of saying that some objects on the VSD require have a certain ordering that is required. So, for instance, a security entry may reference a security profile, and that profile must be created first before the security entry is created. So the MetroAE Config tool automatically reorders the creation of objects based on their dependencies because it understands those dependencies. And then regardless of how the user enters in the information, it will be ordered and correctly applied to the VSD. Secondly, VSDs, the MetroAE Config tool can deal with varying VSD versions, meaning software versions. And the way it does that are the templates are marked with the minimum supported VSD version. And then when configurations are applied to the VSD, the config tool checks the version of the VSD and chooses the most correct template to apply to that VSD based on the supported version. Thirdly, the MetroAE Config tool reads in API specifications. The VSDs, the configuration model for VSDs is defined by JSON files called the VSD API specification. And these are published by the Nuage engineering team. These specification files are read in by the engine, and that is what is used by the engine to understand the structure of the VSD API. It is not hard-coded into the tool. It is completely data-driven, and thus changes to those API specifications or even new API specifications can be loaded in at any time, and thus causes change to the engine to support the new specifications on the VSD. And then finally, documentation is completely automatic. So I mentioned there's a documentation command, an action for MetroAE Config, plus examples that can be generated on the fly directly from the information in the templates, and that is provided. So a lot of you might be thinking, we can just do all of this with Python, and that is absolutely true. None of this, everything that the MetroAE Config tool can do, it can be completely written using a Python module. However, you may not want to do that. MetroAE Config has some advantages over just coding this by scratch. For the main one is it doesn't require coding. So the MetroAE Config tool is completely data-driven. So that means you don't need to write any code. There's less testing involved and less bugs because it's all just data. Another advantage is that the tool is fully extendable even to features that haven't even been developed yet. So as I had mentioned before, the config tool reads VSD API specifications. These are data files, JSON data files. Thus, if a new feature is developed on the VSD and you want to support it in the MetroAE Config tool, you load that VSD API spec into the tool, and it now is fully supported by the tool without changing any code whatsoever. I had mentioned that it handles VSD versioning. If you have a VSD that's 5.4.1 and a VSD that's 6.03, there are configuration changes that occurred over that major version change. The templates are chosen based on the VSD version that it's being applied to, and there are a different template than for 5.4.1 than there is for 6.03, and the appropriate one would be chosen for the VSD automatically. And then finally, we are providing, with the tool shipping, a vast library of templates that are already fully tested and available, ready for use. So over 75 of those, and we plan on making more. All right, great. Well, thanks for listening. At this point, I'm going to hand the sharing off to Ishwar, and he's going to do a live demo for us to demonstrate the use of MetroAE Config to apply a real configuration to a VSD.
Perhaps we could also just pause for a moment if there are any initial questions. I think a lot of questions will be answered when Ishwar does his demo, but does anyone have any questions at this time?
I have a question, Brian and Michael. Was there a reason why a max version on the template was not included in the design for cases where piece of the API may be retired over time?
I mean, it could be. So the way it kind of works is that the minimum version is used because what it does is when you load your templates, it's going to try to take the latest version of template that's supported. So you always want the most recent template that's actually supported by the VSD. I suppose there could be a deprecation system, but we haven't created a deprecation system yet.
Okay, thanks.
This is Mark. I have a question about the validation. You mentioned that we can do the validation of the data and the templates. How far does it go into the VSD if it does not create the objects? Is it really sending out the APIs?
Yeah, so I had mentioned that the VSD API specifications are read into the tool. Those API specifications are actually pretty detailed. They contain every object that's supported on the VSD, their names, like enumeration values, ranges, etc. So the configuration tool, the MetroAE Config tool, actually runs through all of the template rendering internally, and then it simulates the application of those configuration objects, even through looking at the specifications, so that it would know that if like a bad enumeration value or something was out of range, it would be able to detect that. Or if you're trying to put, a configuration object that doesn't belong under a certain parent, all of those things would be detected. It's not foolproof. So there are certain things that the VSD validates that the tool cannot detect, particularly complex things like when one value equals this, then the other value cannot equal this, right? Those kind of checks, which the VSD does. The tool doesn't have any ability to understand that. So it's not foolproof, but it's pretty good. It does. It catches most, at least syntactical and like range checking and that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, Ishwar, you're on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ishwar, and I'm going to be doing the live demo. So let me go ahead and share my screen quickly. Okay. Okay, live demo. So what are we going to talk about in the live demo? So in the demo, we're going to actually talk about installing a basic infrastructure where we're going to create an enterprise profile, and then I'm going to go ahead, create some gateways, ports, and VLANs on that. And then I'm going to show creation of L3 domains and L2 domains along with their subnets and zones. In the second part of the demo, then I'm going to actually talk about security policies. So I'm going to actually create an ingress and an egress ACL entry and an ACL policy there. In the third part of the demo, I'm going to talk about adding extra stuff to the existing infrastructure, like adding another domain and security policies on top of it. At the very end, I'm going to actually talk about reverting or removing all the configuration that we've made and put the VSD back to a clean slate. So let me go ahead, pull up my terminal real quick. So the current way we have been delivering MetroAE config is part of as a container. So everything actually has to be dealt with in the container itself. So when we actually set up a container for the first time, right, there's actually a setup process where the container actually asks for the data path, which is actually where the container mounts the file on the host system. In my case, I've actually created the MetroAE data under temp directory. So if you actually look at the temp MetroAE data, this is actually what the container is actually having an access to the system through. So before going into the details of the demo, I want to show you where to get documentation and everything. So as part of the MetroAE data folder, the standard templates are where we have actually defined the templates that we support at this point. And there is, as you can see, there's the documentation folder, which contains the MD files for each template. So it gives you an explanation on what the template is and what kind of stuff it does. So for all the 75 templates, we have the MD files listed here. In the examples folder under the standard templates, you can find examples of each template based on the groups. So you can pick and choose specific groups. So if you're actually just interested in infra, you can actually just choose the network group or the DC infra or the admin group and stuff like that. So the demo that I'm going to actually do right now is a subset of the example data that I actually have here. So for the case of the demo, I have actually created a demo directory under my MetroAE data that the container can access to. And I actually have 3 files here. Like I have the initial config, then I'm going to have the security policy, and then the domain to demo, right? So before we actually get started and start running the MetroAE config tool, right? So there are a couple things that we can do to actually make running the tool much easier for us. So as part of the MetroAE config, we actually have this environment file that you can define. This environment file actually contains the path for the templates and the VSD specifications that's going to be read by the config tool. The explanation for that is all actually in here. So if you look at the documentation folder, there should be enough explanation on how to use the config tool and what kind of variables that you can define in here and how to run the config commands and stuff like that. There's information all there here. That's the documentation for the tool itself. For the templates, you have to go into the standard templates documentation for looking at the template documentation. Now, I'm going to actually go ahead and run MetroAE config create, and I'm going to specify the okay. So I'm going to run the MetroAE config create, and the -v option here specifies which VSD I need to target it at. And the DP actually specifies the data path that I'm going to use. In this case, I'm actually using the initial config. So even before we get there, let me actually go over the initial config with you guys so that you have an idea on what I'm trying to do. So as I was saying, I'm going to actually go ahead, create a couple DC gateways, subnets underneath it, zones, and then I'm going to create a L2 domain and L3 domain here. And then I'm going to actually go ahead, create DC gateway ports. I'm going ahead and creating enterprise values and enterprise permissions for all the VLANs that we are going to do. So one thing that I want to point out that's unique to this tool is when you're actually creating VLANs, right? So if you actually say, I want to create VLANs from, like, for example, let's choose this example right here, which says 31 to 33. For this, right, you just actually have to give a range of VLANs that you want to be created on that port, and we'll end up going and creating all those VLANs. So it's going to create a VLAN for 31, VLAN for 32, and a VLAN for 33. If you want to actually have multiple VLANs with different, not in the same range, but different numbers, you can actually have it as a comma separated value. You can even nest these things together as well. So if you want actually something like this with ranges in the middle, you can still do this. So this is actually going to create a VLAN for 1, then 12 to 16, and 22 to 26, and 32 VLANs there. So I'm going to go ahead and run the create for this config. The output that you're seeing right now is actually all the commands it's executing on the VSD, like creation, selection of all that stuff. So let's quickly log into the VSD. Okay. Now you can see the demo enterprise that I created. If you go into the networks, you'll actually see the L3 domain that I have here. And then if you look at the subnets that I have all these subnets listed here. If you, okay, and then that's the net. If you look at the infrastructure, you'll see the DC gateway that I've created, all the ports, and all the VLANs that I've associated with that port. So it creates all the ranges, like you talked about, like 22 to 26. So it creates the VLAN 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and behind. Now I'm going to go ahead, apply the security config. So as you can see, in the L3 domain, in the subnets and policies, I don't actually have an ingress or an egress policy right now defined. So I'm going to actually show you what the policy looks like. Okay, so this actually is the policy that I'm going to be defining in the system right now. So the template name that I'm using is a bidirectional security policy entry and a bidirectional security policy. What does a bidirectional security policy in this case mean, right? So instead of creating an ingress and an egress policy separately, when you specify this, it creates both of them at the same time with the options that you have specified here. So I'm going to go ahead and create the security policy now. Okay. One thing that we need to be careful when we are specifying the data paths is we always have to make this path relative to the container. Even though my path actually says temp MetroAE data, that's not visible to the container. The container only sees the path as MetroAE data. So that's why I'm specifying the MetroAE data here as my path information. If this is not specified, the container wouldn't be able to find where your data is, right? It's not going to not be able to read the host system files. So when you specify this is the mount point for the container. So everything actually, the container can actually move from this relative path at that point. I'm going to go ahead and create it now.
Yeah, hi, Ishwar. My name is Sarma. I have a question quickly. For example, you said that we can create the L3 domains and etc. etc. So how because in the customer network we have a lot of IP addresses that are tagged to each zones. So is it a manual process to fill in this, or can it import from an Excel sheet or something like that? How it actually creates and fill it in those templates?
Oh, you're talking about user data here, right? So right now it's all a manual process, but if it's something that you can actually say it's useful for us, like creating an Excel sheet and importing it that way, that's something that we can definitely support in the future. But currently, right now, all the user data has to be manually entered. So it's a YAML file. So let me go back to the initial config so you can see it, right? Or actually, let's. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
I'd like to actually point out, it's not an announced feature yet, but we're actually going to be supporting in the near future Excel spreadsheet export to user data.
Yes.
So it actually may be something that we could create one of these templates directly from a spreadsheet. I can't claim to be able to do it today. We have tooling already developed to do something like that in the near future.
I think
that's definitely something that we can support in the future.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay. As I was actually pointing in the demo, right? So I actually went ahead and created the security policy user data. So it goes ahead, creates a ingress ACL template and an ingress ACL template entry as well. So now if you go back to the VSD, now you see the ingress and the egress templates and with the ACL entries associated with that. So you can actually embed any number of ACL entries that you want to get created as part of this stuff. So if you, so let's look at the user data for the domain 2 that I'm going to actually add on top of the existing infrastructure. In one of the slides, Mike was pointing out to a tree structure of actually having user data. So in this case, if you look at it, right, my domain name is actually the top tree, and then the zone actually is a child underneath it, and subnet is actually part of that information as well. So all this actually becomes the tree, and then everything gets created underneath it. And then I'm putting a bidirectional security policy on the newly created domain. Okay. So if I'm going to go ahead and create anything now, I'm going to create it with the domain 2.
Yeah, I think it's important that people understand that, things like that bidirectional security policy, that's an example of how these templates have been created in a way that simplifies the amount of work that's required. So because it's bidirectional, we go ahead and create the ingress and egress both so that you don't have to do those separately.
Yes. We actually have templates defined for just creating the ingress ACL template and the entry. You don't have to use the bidirectional security policy if you don't want to use an egress or stuff like that. So that actually is part of the 75 templates that we already have. So one thing that I forgot to mention is the first thing that the config tool does is figure out the VSD version. In this case, it detects that it's a 603 version of the VSD. So all the templates that can be applied to a 603 are the only ones that get picked up. If you have a 5.1 BSD and if your template doesn't support it, that template won't get picked up as part of this user data. So I went ahead and created the new domain. So I'm going to actually go back to the VSD. So my L3 domain EMEA is up here. Now, if you look at it, I have subnets defined in here. The subnet's there. And then if you look at the policy is also as part of it now. We have the policy and the policy entry for both. Okay, so the next part of the demo is going to be say, okay, so I've applied this incremental config, but I'm not sure I need this anymore, right? So the one way that we could do is we have the revert functionality as part of it. So if you go into the Metro config and say revert and give the user data for domain 2. So let's go ahead and run this. What this is going to do is it's going to actually go ahead and remove the newly added domain. So if we go back to the system, the EMEA is gone now. So as you can see in the output here, so whenever you do a revert, it actually does the inverse action of a create. So it actually goes to the child object first and then removes that and then keeps going up the parent chain until he is done. So in this case, he removes the egress ACL entry template and then the template afterwards. Same thing with the ingress. And then you have the subnet that's being removed, then the zone, then the domain, and the domain template associated with the L3 domain. So that's how the process works. It's always the inverse order of the create. One good thing about the revert functionality is you can always use the user data to go back to a clean slate. So you can remove all the configuration that you have in the system. So if I go ahead and trace my steps back and actually remove the configuration that I've done so far, everything is actually going to be removed. So you don't have to go to the VSD, do manual clicks and stuff like that and delete. This is very simple to go ahead and do the configuration reverts, right?
Is there also an option to do like GitOps style kind of configuration? You know, right now you're removing or reverting a specific YAML, but I see like people pushing the domains and subnets and stuff they need into Git. And then if they don't need it, they just drop it out of there, and it wouldn't be defined anymore. Know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're saying like if you actually have the domains and the subnets defined in the Git and you remove a subnet from there, you want automatically removed from the VSD.
Yes.
Yeah, the thing is, right? So the good thing about this tool right now is that it actually just reverts the YAML data that you have. So if you have something that actually converts the GitOps to like a simple YAML file, it can actually do that, right? So in this case, if I, let's go back to the user data. MetroAE data, demo, domain 2, right? In this YAML file here, if I just actually had the subnet template and nothing else, it would have just removed the subnet and left everything else the same. Is that kind of answering the question?
Yeah, it does answer the question, but yeah, I would have hoped it would work in a different mode as well. But yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
So now if you go back to the VSD, everything is removed, right? So the whole entire infrastructure is removed, the domain, demo enterprise, everything is gone. Okay. Couple things that I want to actually talk about is, so as Mike was talking about in his slides, if you want to look at the list of templates that are supported by the container at this point, so if you go in, say, MetroAE Config templates, and this is actually, hold on. So if you go into the MetroAE config and templates and say list, this lists out all the templates that are supported. These are all the 75 templates that are actually part of it here. So if you're looking to actually say, okay, that's great, I understand that, but now I want to actually see examples of templates. So let's pick a template, right? So let's actually say enterprise, because that's actually the simple one. So if you actually say this, and if you say MetroAE config example and give the template name, it's going to actually print out the information of it. So it's going to actually print out all the values that are supported on it, like the enterprise name. It's going to even go ahead and tell you if the variable is required or not. So OPT means it's an optional thing. So in this case, the description is optional, the profile name is optional, forwarding classes are optional, load balances, everything is optional, right? If it's not optional, then you wouldn't actually see that, you would just see this, because we basically require a main name at a minimum. If you don't specify the profile name, we'll actually use the enterprise name as its profile name in this case. Okay, that concludes the demo. Any more questions?
There are a couple questions in chat. One question, which is a really interesting question. So someone asked, is the tool going to be supported in more than just the Nuage VSD? The interesting thing about this tool is it's actually modular. There's a component called a writer, and the writer is what applies the configuration to the VSD. But the writer is actually separate from the templating portion of the tool. So it is indeed possible, but it's not a trivial amount of work to actually support other devices other than the Nuage VSD. In fact, our team has prototyped an SROS writer, which allows us to configure SROS devices like the WBX. But it's really just a prototype. We've never planned to actually release that. But if there's interest in something like that, it could be developed further. There's another question in chat about under the slides about the indentation of the children. Ishwar, would you mind bringing up the nested configuration slide? Do you have that?
Yeah, I do. Nested configuration slide?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Let me go to my...
So it was asked if the children key was at the wrong level, being that it's at the same level as the template. Actually, it's correct. So template and template values in children are actually at the same level. It's just the format of the user data files that like a children is defined under a specific template. And actually, one of the requirements is that you only have exactly one set of values for if you have children, because it doesn't make sense to have multiple parents for the same for one child. Another question is VSC auto config on the roadmap. So I mentioned there is a prototype for SRS configuration. It could theoretically be applied to VSCs, but we haven't. It's not a small amount of work, but I mean we have a lot of infrastructure to support that, something like that. But I can't claim to have anything working. But it's something possible if it's desired.
So in the deploy portion of MetroAE, we recently added support for the application of an arbitrary VSC configuration file to the VSC itself. So that sort of addresses the question, but it's not exactly in the way that this tool works. It's simply give us a config file, we'll put it on the VSC for you. There was one other question that came up, Mike. Is there extensive logs showing UUID of objects that are created?
Yes. Well, there is logging. It's kind of verbose. Ishwar, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm gonna actually show them something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do debug.
Yeah. Debug, and I can even go up to the log levels actually.
Yeah. You probably want to do a small one though, if you can.
I'm gonna need the initial config, so let me actually apply the initial config first, and then we can talk about the other one. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So as part of the tool, we actually have the debug mode as well in it. So if you say debug, it's gonna.
It's dash debug.
Yeah. And I need to change the config file as well. So let's actually do the security policy here. Security policy. I'm gonna actually even go to the log level and do API.
The -- log
dash
level.
log.
Yeah.
Nope, that didn't work.
No, that's not it. Just do debug.
Yeah,
That's good.
for now, let's do debug.
Yeah. I just forget the syntax.
Yeah. So as you can see, this actually gives you more information on the things that it's actually doing. As part of it, you can see the ID here. This ID portion is the UU ID as served with that enterprise. And then this one is for the domain here. So it gives you a lot more information when you do this, when you use the debug mode. So it actually tells you what it's trying to do. And it even goes ahead and shows you the validation phases as well.
Yeah, the validation phase. It's
This is the validate phase. This is the place where we are actually taking the user data and validating against the schema here. So if anything fails, it will actually fail even before it touches the VSD. And this configuration here is the start of actually applying the config on the VSD. And this is your VSD session start, where it tries to connect to the VSD and then goes ahead, does a select on the domain, select on the enterprise with the domain enterprise name and stuff like that, and then goes through everything.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Folks, well, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to point out that we have the Nuage-Metro-Interest mailing list. If you subscribe to that list, you can send us questions about this tool and anything else MetroAE is doing. And for now, thank you so much.